I had exactly $312 in my checking account the day my brother called to tell me I wasn't invited to his engagement party. Not because there wasn't room. Not because the venue was too small. But because his fiancée, Cassandra Elroy, had suggested politely, he said, like she was doing me a favor, that maybe it would be better if I sat this one out. That I might feel out of place. That her family had certain standards for these kinds of events, and she wanted everyone to be comfortable. Comfortable. That word sat in my throat like a stone. I told Marcus I understood. I told him no hard feelings. I put the phone down on my kitchen table in my small apartment in Columbus, Ohio, and I stared at the water stain on the ceiling for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and checked the quarterly earnings report for Elroy and Marsh Consulting Group, the firm where both Cassandra and her father, Lawrence Elroy, were senior partners. I scrolled to the bottom of the page, past the revenue projections and the client retention figures, past the executive bios with their professional headshots and their impressive credentials. And there, buried in the ownership disclosure, was a name they had never bothered to look up. Mine. Let me take you back. My name is Dana Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Zanesville, Ohio, in a house that was always slightly too cold in winter because my father believed keeping the thermostat above 62 was a form of personal weakness. My mother, Carol, worked as a school lunch aide for 22 years. My brother Marcus is 3 years older than me, and from the moment he drew his first breath according to our father, the one who is going to do something with his life. I want to be careful here, because the story of being the overlooked sibling is one a lot of people know, and I don't want to perform it for you. What I will say is this. The way my family treated me wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It wasn't the kind of thing that would make anyone in the room gasp if they witnessed it. It was quiet, consistent. The kind of dismissal that feels ordinary enough that you start to wonder if maybe you're imagining it. Marcus got the car for his 16th birthday. I got a gift card to a bookstore and a conversation about how I needed to be more practical about my future. Marcus graduated from Ohio State with a business degree, and our father threw him a party with a rented tent in the backyard. When I graduated from the same university with an accounting degree the following year, my mother made a lasagna. It was a good lasagna, but it was still just a lasagna. I don't tell you this to make you feel sorry for me. I tell you this so you understand the soil I grew from. After graduation, I took a job as a junior auditor at a mid-sized firm in Columbus. The pay was modest and the work was unglamorous, but I was good at it. Better than good. I had a mind for numbers the way some people have a mind for music. I could look at a balance sheet and hear it, almost literally hear the places where something was off. A frequency that didn't match. A note held a half beat too long. I spent 4 years at that firm, and then did something that made my father shake his head at a family dinner. I left a stable job to start my own financial consulting practice. Just me, a laptop, a rented office the size of a large walk-in closet, and a list of 12 small business owners who believed in me enough to trust me with their books. My father said I was making a mistake. Marcus said I was being impulsive. My mother said nothing, which somehow felt worse. 2 years after that, I had 40 clients. The year after that, I had 90, and I had hired my first 2 employees. By the time I was 31, Whitfield Financial Partners had grown into something I couldn't have imagined from that tiny office. Not flashy, not famous, but real and solid and entirely mine. I made careful acquisitions. That's the part people don't realize, that financial consulting firms grow in interesting ways if you're patient and strategic. When smaller firms needed to restructure, or when a retiring partner wanted to exit gracefully, I was often the person they called. I had a reputation for being fair, discreet, and good at not making a mess. One of those acquisitions 3 years ago was a 12% ownership stake in a mid-sized consulting group based in Cleveland. The kind of purchase that doesn't make headlines. The kind that gets filed with the appropriate state agencies and then lives quietly in a drawer while the business goes about its business. The firm was called Elroy and Marsh Consulting Group. I bought the stake from a retiring minority partner named Howard Marsh, who wanted out quickly and cleanly after a health scare. He came to me through a mutual contact, and the transaction was handled by lawyers and signed and notarized and perfectly boring. I had never met Lawrence Elroy. I had no particular interest in the internal workings of the firm. It was a sound investment with a reasonable return, and I had a dozen like it. What I did not know at the time was that Marcus was dating Lawrence Elroy's daughter. I found out the way I found out most things about my family's life, accidentally, during a phone call that was really about something else. Marcus mentioned Cassandra in passing, said she worked in consulting, said her family was from Cleveland, said she was incredible, that she was polished and sharp and knew exactly what she wanted. I remember thinking, good for him. I had nothing against Cassandra Elroy. I didn't know her. That changed over the following 18 months. The first time I met her was at Thanksgiving. Marcus brought her to our parents' house in Zanesville, and she arrived in a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my mother's monthly grocery budget. Carrying a bottle of wine, she presented like she was bestowing a gift upon a village. She was beautiful in that precise, deliberate way, the way that takes effort to look effortless. She shook my hand with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said she'd heard so much about me. She hadn't. I could tell. Marcus hadn't mentioned me at all. Over dinner, Cassandra talked about Cleveland, about the firm, about her father's success, about a charity gala she was helping organize, about the vacation they were planning to Portugal. She was charming in the way that people are charming when they've been trained to be, when social grace is less a natural warmth and more a professional skill. At some point, my father asked Marcus about his work. Marcus worked in regional sales for a manufacturing company, a solid job, nothing remarkable. Cassandra put her hand on his arm and said he was actually exploring some opportunities through her father's network, that Lawrence had taken a real interest in Marcus, that big things were coming. My father beamed. My mother asked Cassandra to describe Portugal. Nobody asked about my work. I drove back to Columbus that night through a steady Ohio drizzle and reminded myself, not for the first time, that I had stopped needing their approval somewhere around my 20th birthday. It was a fact I had to remind myself of more often than I liked to admit, but it was still a fact. The second time I met Cassandra was at Easter. This time there were more of her family's friends present, people her parents had apparently invited at my mother's enthusiastic suggestion. People with good jobs and good clothes, and the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having been made to feel small. Cassandra's mother, Vivian Elroy, was there, a woman so carefully put together she looked like an architectural drawing of a person. Vivian looked at my off-brand flats and my clearance rack blazer with the kind of smile that doesn't require words to deliver its message. She asked what I did, and when I said I ran a financial consulting firm, she nodded the way people nod when they're not listening and said how nice, before turning back to her conversation. Later, in the kitchen, I heard Cassandra tell someone that Marcus's sister was in accounting, making it sound like I worked in a back office somewhere tallying receipts. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. It was the version of me that fit neatly into the corner she'd assigned me to. I washed my hands, dried them, and went back to the dining room. I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that people who believe you're beneath them will never be convinced otherwise by your words. Only by your actions. And only when the timing is right. The engagement was announced in September. Marcus called me on a Tuesday evening, sounding happier than I had heard him in years. He said Cassandra had said yes, that her father had given his blessing, that they were planning something for spring, that everything was coming together. I told him I was happy for him. I meant it. He called me back 3 days later with the news about the party. His voice was careful, the way your voice gets when you've rehearsed what you're going to say because you know the person on the other end isn't going to like it. He said Cassandra's family was hosting an engagement dinner at the Elroy's home in Chagrin Falls, one of those well-off suburbs east of Cleveland, a formal sit-down for about 60 guests, mostly the Elroy family circle. He said Cassandra felt it might be more comfortable to keep the guest list tight to people who knew each other well. I asked if our parents were invited. He said yes, our parents were invited. I let that sit for a moment. He said there would be a separate celebration for my side of the family. Something casual. Maybe over the holidays. He said he was sorry. He didn't sound sorry. He sounded relieved to have gotten the words out. I said I understood. I said to have a wonderful time. I hung up. I sat with it for a while. The specific quality of that feeling when someone you love treats you as the version of yourself that other people have decided you are, rather than the version you actually are. It's a strange grief, that one. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in quietly like cold weather moving through the walls. Then I thought about what I knew. And what I knew is this. Elroy and Marsh Consulting Group had been operating for 11 years. I had owned my 12% stake for 3 of those years. In that time, I had received my quarterly distributions and my annual reports and asked very few questions because the investment was performing well and I had other things to think about. But something had been nagging at me for the past several months. Nothing concrete. Just that frequency. That note held a half beat too long. The most recent quarterly distribution had been slightly lower than projected, with a note from the firm's internal accounting team citing restructuring costs. The note was vague in a way that competent accountants don't usually allow themselves to be vague. I had flagged it mentally and moved on. I had not yet pulled the thread. I pulled the thread the night after Marcus called. I am a financial forensic specialist by training and by instinct. I know how to read documents the way a doctor reads an X-ray, knowing which shadows are normal and which ones require a second opinion. I spent 3 evenings going through every report, every filing, every disclosure that Elroy and Marsh had provided to its investors over the past 2 years. By the end of the 3rd evening, I had a legal pad covered in notes and a very specific, very uncomfortable feeling in my chest. The restructuring costs were real, but they were also, if you looked at them from the right angle, a way of moving money. Not illegally, not yet, but in a pattern that experienced eyes would recognize. Assets being revalued. Contracts being routed through a newly formed LLC. Advisory fees being paid to a consulting entity that I could not find any public record of. I needed a forensic accountant. Not because I couldn't do the work myself, but because what I was beginning to suspect required documentation that could stand up to scrutiny, and I was too close to this one to be objective. I called Terrence Bogue the next morning. Terrence was a forensic accountant I had worked with twice before on fraud investigations for 2 different clients. He was meticulous, licensed, credentialed, and the kind of person who communicated almost entirely through documents and footnotes. He had testified as an expert witness in 3 federal cases. He asked no unnecessary questions and delivered his findings without drama. I told him I had an investment I needed looked at. I sent him everything I had. I told him I needed a preliminary finding within 10 days and a full report within 30. He sent back a single-line email. He said he'd be in touch. While I waited, I went to the engagement party. I know. You're wondering why. I wondered too. Marcus had called the week after his first call, voice lighter this time, to say that Cassandra's mother had suggested they extend the invitation to include me after all. A last-minute addition. He said it in a way that suggested this was generous of them. I said I would come. I want to be honest about my reasoning. Part of it was the professional part. I had a financial stake in a firm owned by this family, and I had questions about that firm that were not yet answered. Being in a room with Lawrence Elroy felt useful. The other part of me, the part that is still in some ways the girl from that too-cold house in Zanesville, wanted to walk into that room and see how it felt. I'm not proud of that, but it's true. Chagrin Falls is the kind of place where the trees have been there longer than the families, and the families like it that way. The Elroy house sat back from the road at the end of a driveway lined with old oaks. It was large without being vulgar about it. Fieldstone exterior, black shutters, a front porch with rocking chairs that probably got sat in twice a year. I wore a dress I'd owned for 2 years, a simple navy wrap dress that I liked because it was comfortable and didn't ask anything of me. My hair was down. I drove myself. The event was catered. About 50 people, give or take. Silver trays, monogrammed napkins, the kind of flowers that are arranged to look unstudied. Lawrence Elroy held court near the fireplace in the main room, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s with silver hair and the manner of someone who has spent decades being the most important person in every room he enters. He had the handshake of a man who knows handshakes matter. Cassandra moved through the room with the fluid ease of someone hosting her natural habitat. She wore a pale gold dress that matched the event perfectly, because she had designed the event around herself. She greeted me at the door with a smile that was correctly warm and said she was so glad I could make it after all. There was a fraction of a pause before after all that lasted about 1/4 of a second too long. Long enough for both of us to feel it. I smiled back and said what a beautiful home. I found Marcus near the bar. He hugged me, and I could feel in the hug both his genuine affection and his general discomfort. Marcus has always been a man caught between the people he loves and the person he wants to be seen as, and those two things have never quite lined up for him. He looked good. Happy. The kind of happy that is real, but also slightly desperate to remain undisturbed. I met Vivian Elroy, who shook my hand with 3 fingers and asked if I'd had trouble with the drive. I met Cassandra's brother, a man named Fletcher who worked at the firm in some capacity and wore a suit that had been measured to the millimeter. I met various family friends and business associates and people whose names I wouldn't remember because they didn't stay in the room long enough to matter. And then I found a seat at a table near the windows and did what I was actually there to do. I watched Lawrence Elroy work the room. He was good. I'll give him that. He had the rhythm of a man who knew how to make people feel chosen. He gave each conversation his full attention for exactly as long as it needed, then moved on in a way that felt natural rather than calculated. He laughed at the right times. He touched shoulders. He was, in the language of wealth and influence, fluent. But twice during the evening, I watched something flicker across his face that didn't belong there. Once when a man in a gray suit leaned in and said something brief and quiet during a handshake that lasted a second longer than normal. And once when he glanced at his phone during the cocktail hour and went very still before putting it back in his jacket pocket. I know that look. I've seen it in boardrooms and depositions and audit reviews. It's the look of someone who knows a number is wrong and is trying to decide what to do about it. After dinner, Lawrence gave a toast. He spoke about Cassandra with the measured pride of a man who has worked hard and wants the world to see the result of that work. He spoke about Marcus with the careful warmth of someone welcoming a new piece to a collection he's been building. He raised his glass and said family was everything, that when you build something real, you build it for the people you love. Everyone drank. I drank too. Then Cassandra asked everyone to gather for photos in the reception room, and in the shuffle of 60 people moving from one room to another, I ended up near the hallway that led to Lawrence's study. The door was slightly open. I am not the kind of person who snoops. I want to be clear about that. But I am the kind of person who notices when the door is slightly open, and I am the kind of person who, when they hear 2 voices having a conversation and careful, lowered tones that have the particular texture of a conversation not meant to be overheard, slows down enough to hear it. Lawrence's voice. And the voice of the man in the gray suit. The man in the gray suit said the Henderson Group was asking for the audit trail. He said they were getting difficult. He said they needed answers by the end of the quarter, or they were going to take it to the SEC. Lawrence said to keep them quiet. He said to offer them a partial distribution and tell them the rest was tied up in the restructuring. He said he needed 6 more weeks. The man in the gray suit said 6 weeks was a long time. Lawrence said to make it work. His voice had shifted. The warmth from the toast was entirely gone. What was left was something harder, something efficient. He said they were too close to let one anxious investor derail everything. He said the partnership with Marcus was going to open doors, that the Burns family connections would help shore up their credibility with the Midwest client base. The man asked what connections. Lawrence said that Cassandra had done her research, that Marcus's family had significant financial holdings through a company called Whitfield Financial Partners based in Columbus, that the principal was Marcus's sister, that she was quiet about it, didn't advertise, but that the assets were real and the reputation was solid. He said once the marriage was formalized, the Elroy-Whitfield connection would give them something to point to. The man in the gray suit said, what if the sister was difficult? Lawrence said not to worry about the sister. He said she was, and I'm using his exact word here, peripheral. I stood in that hallway for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then I walked to the reception room and smiled for the photographs. Peripheral. I have been called a lot of things in my life. quiet, practical, a little too serious, a lot too serious, stubborn, focused, efficient. My college roommate used to call me the human spreadsheet, which I took as a compliment even when she didn't mean it that way. But peripheral was new. Peripheral meant existing only in relation to someone else, that my entire life's work was useful to these people only as a background detail, as credibility they could borrow without asking, as a reference they could cite without my knowledge or my consent. I drove home that night without the radio on. I thought about what they were planning. The Henderson Group was going to the SEC. Lawrence Elroy needed 6 weeks and something that looked like stability. He had decided that stability was me, or rather, the version of me that he understood, which was the version that was a footnote to my own family's story. He had no idea I owned 12% of his firm. He had no idea that when the SEC came looking, the minority ownership disclosure would have my name on it. He had no idea that I was already 3 days into an investigation. I called Terrence the next morning and told him to move the timeline up. I told him I needed a preliminary within 5 days. Terrence sent back one word. Understood. I want to stop here and say something. Because I've told this story a few times now, to my lawyer, to a journalist who covered the eventual proceedings, and to Terrence himself after everything was finished. And every time I get to this part, people ask me if I was angry, if I was thinking about revenge. The honest answer is no. Not yet. What I was thinking about was the Henderson Group. Real people. Investors who had given Lawrence Elroy their money in good faith. People who were now being asked to wait, being managed, being offered partial payments, while the firm's internal accounting ran its rerouting operation through shell structures and LLC fees. I thought about the 23 junior employees at Elroy and Marsh whose retirement accounts were tied to the firm's long-term stability. I thought about the clients whose financial planning was built on advice given by a firm with numbers that didn't fully add up. I thought about what happened to people like that when the floor gave way. That was what moved me. Not the toast at the engagement party. Not the hallway conversation. Not even being called peripheral, though I won't pretend that landed without weight. What moved me was the Henderson Group. What moved me was those 23 employees. Terrence called me 5 days later, 40 minutes before I was expecting him. He said he needed me to sit down. I was already sitting. I told him to go ahead. He said the LLC routing was more developed than a preliminary scan usually caught. He said the entity receiving the advisory fees was registered in Delaware under a name he had traced through 2 layers to a company jointly controlled by Lawrence Elroy and a man named Gregory Fenn. He said Gregory Fenn was a name that came up in a 2019 civil suit in Cuyahoga County involving a different firm that had been dissolved under contested circumstances. He said the pattern was consistent with what forensic accountants called a slow drain structure. Nothing catastrophic in any single transaction. Everything defensible in isolation. But the cumulative effect over 18 months was the movement of approximately $3.4 million in investor capital into an entity that did not provide services commensurate with the fees it was paid. $3.4 million. He said he was still working on the full report, but that I should know about the Henderson Group. He said they had filed a preliminary complaint with the SEC 2 days ago. He said it was not yet public, but that the window before it became public was short. I said thank you, Terrence. I put the phone face down on my desk. And I sat with it. $3.4 million. The Henderson Group. 23 employees. One filing that was 2 days old and not yet public. 6 weeks, Lawrence had said. He needed 6 weeks. He didn't have 6 weeks. He had, at most, 3. I called my attorney. My attorney is a woman named Priya Mehta. She has practiced securities and corporate law in Ohio for 14 years, and she has, in my experience, 2 modes. There is the mode where she is thinking, which is quiet and still and could easily be mistaken for boredom. And there is the mode where she has thought, which is efficient and certain and moves at a pace that makes other lawyers look like they're walking through water. I told her everything. The original investment. The quarterly anomalies that had flagged my attention. The hallway conversation. Terrence's preliminary findings. The Henderson Group. The LLC in Delaware. Gregory Fenn. Priya was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted. Then she was in her second mode. She said this wasn't about me anymore, that the moment an SEC complaint was filed, this became a matter for regulators and potentially federal prosecutors. She said my role as a minority stakeholder with documented concerns and forensic findings was going to be significant. She said I needed to understand what I was stepping into. I told her I understood. She said I also needed to understand that the Elroys did not know what I knew or of who I was in relation to this firm. She said that was a strategic advantage I needed to handle carefully. I told her I understood that too. She said she was going to make a call to the SEC's Cleveland regional office. She said she was going to get me in front of the right people before the end of the week. She said in the meantime, I should not contact Marcus or anyone in the Elroy family. She said she needed me to act like nothing had changed. I told her that was something I had a lot of practice with. She said she'd call me tomorrow. I went back to work. I had 4 client meetings that week, a quarterly review for a small manufacturing firm in Dayton, a new business consultation with a restaurant group out of Cincinnati, a property investment assessment that I'd been putting off for 2 weeks. Normal work. Careful work. The kind of work that I had built over 11 years from that too-cold house and those 2 years of believing my father's assessment of my future. I am mentioning these normal days because I think people expect the period before a reckoning to feel dramatic. It doesn't. Or it didn't, for me. It felt like what it was, careful work. Document by document. Detail by detail. The same way I had always worked. Priya called the next afternoon. She had spoken to an agent named Reginald Marsh from the SEC's Cleveland office, no relation to Howard Marsh. She said Agent Marsh was very interested in what she described. She said he had indicated that the Henderson Group's filing had flagged the same LLC routing that Terrence had identified. She said my forensic documentation would be meaningful to their investigation. She said Agent Marsh wanted to meet with me the following Tuesday. I said Tuesday worked. The meeting was in a conference room in a federal building in Cleveland that smelled like recycled air and institutional coffee. Agent Marsh was a man in his early 50s with reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and a habit of writing in the margins of his own notes. He had been with the SEC for 20 years and had the precise, unhurried manner of someone who understands that complex financial cases are marathons and acts accordingly. I brought Terrence, I brought Priya, and I brought 3 folders of documentation. Terrence walked Agent Marsh through the forensic findings. Priya provided the legal context. I answered questions. At one point, Agent Marsh looked at the ownership disclosure, the one that showed my 12% stake, and then he looked at me. He said I was Lawrence Elroy's future sister-in-law. I said that was currently the plan, yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said this was a complicated situation. I said it was. I said I also thought it was important that the Henderson Group's investors and the firm's employees had someone willing to document what had happened clearly and carefully, and that I was prepared to do that. He looked at the folders. He said he appreciated the thoroughness. Priya told me afterward that Agent Marsh had called her 2 hours after the meeting to say my documentation was the most organized whistleblower package he'd received in 6 years. She sounded pleased in the specific way that Priya sounds pleased, which is measured and professional and still somehow very satisfying. The next 2 weeks were a kind of controlled waiting. The SEC investigation moved forward. Terrence completed his full forensic report and submitted it formally. Agent Marsh's team had subpoenaed the firm's internal records. It was not yet public. It would not remain not public for much longer. And then Marcus called. He wanted to plan the casual family celebration he'd mentioned months ago, the one that was supposed to make up for not being invited to the engagement party. He said Cassandra was actually excited to host something at the Elroy house again, something smaller, more intimate, just the immediate families. He said her parents were looking forward to getting to know me better. I closed my eyes. He said Cassandra had even said she wanted to personally make sure I felt included this time. He said the word personally like it was a gift. I told Marcus that sounded lovely. I told him I could do the following Saturday. I told him I was looking forward to it. I hung up and called Priya. I told her the Elroys had just invited me to their home. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Do you want to go? I said yes. She said she'd make a call to Agent Marsh. The following Saturday arrived gray and cold with the flat November sky that Ohio does particularly well. I drove to Chagrin Falls. I wore the same navy wrap dress. Not as a statement. Just because it was comfortable, and the day was going to be long enough without worrying about clothes. The gathering was smaller this time. Lawrence and Vivian. Fletcher with a woman I hadn't met before, apparently recently serious. Marcus and Cassandra. And me. It was a Sunday lunch situation. Catered again, though less formally this time. A white tablecloth in the dining room, a fire going in the main fireplace, the kind of scene that in a different reality would have been warm and genuine and exactly what a family gathering should look like. Lawrence greeted me at the door personally. He was warm in the practiced, thorough way he'd been at the engagement party, but there was something slightly different underneath it this time. A deliberateness. He said he'd been meaning to get to know me better. He said Marcus spoke so highly of me. He said the family was lucky to have someone with my background. I said it was kind of him to say so. He asked about my work. Not the way most people in my family asked, which was politely and without real interest, but with the specific attentiveness of a man who had done some research. He asked about the size of my client base, about the types of consulting I specialized in, about whether I'd looked at any portfolio expansion recently. I told him I had several active investments. He asked what sectors. I said mostly financial services firms. I said I liked the space because I understood the numbers from the inside. He smiled. He said that was exactly the kind of mind a family needed. I smiled back. We sat down to lunch. It was, objectively, a good lunch. The food was excellent. The conversation was carried along on the kind of surface ease that money and practice produce. Vivian was warmer than she'd been at the engagement party, asking me genuine questions about growing up in Zanesville, nodding with what appeared to be real interest. Fletcher's new girlfriend, whose name was Anya, was a teacher from Mentor who seemed slightly baffled by the whole setting, but was handling it with grace. Cassandra sat across from me. She had made good on her promise to make me feel included. She directed conversation toward me, deferred to my opinions on a few topics, laughed at something I said about Ohio winters in a way that felt almost genuine. She was very good. If I hadn't heard what I heard in that hallway 2 weeks prior, if I hadn't spent the past 2 weeks in federal conference rooms with forensic documents, I might have decided I'd misjudged her. But I had heard what I heard. And I had spent those weeks where I'd spent them. After lunch, Lawrence suggested a tour of the property. He showed me the back gardens, the greenhouse Vivian had added 3 years ago, the view down toward the river. We walked side by side, and I could feel the conversation he was building toward the way you can feel weather coming before it arrives. He said he'd done a little research on Whitfield Financial Partners. He said it was impressive, that I had built something quietly significant. He said he admired people who let their work speak for itself without needing to make noise about it. I said thank you. He said he'd actually been curious about whether I'd ever considered any strategic partnership opportunities. He said Elroy and Marsh was at a growth stage where bringing in aligned partners could be advantageous for everyone involved. He said with Marcus and Cassandra's marriage coming up, it seemed natural to think about how the two families might work together. He said it with the ease of a man making a generous offer. A man sharing an opportunity. I looked out at the river below. I said it was an interesting idea. I said I'd always believed in making sure any partnership was built on a clear understanding of both parties' positions. He said absolutely, completely agree. I said including full financial transparency. I said I found that the most important partnerships were ones where nothing was hidden in the structure. There was a brief pause. So brief that if you weren't watching for it, you'd miss it. He said of course. He said transparency was foundational. I nodded. I said I'd give it some thought. We walked back to the house. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking that was the moment. That was where I said something, revealed something, showed my hand. But that's not how it works. That's not how it ever works, not when it matters. Power doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It simply exists, and it waits, and it moves at the right time. I drove home that afternoon and called Priya. She said Agent Marsh was ready to move. She said the SEC had enough to open a formal investigation and issue document preservation demands to the firm. She said the process was going to become public within the next 10 days. She said I needed to decide how I wanted to be positioned when that happened. She said I had options. I could be a passive minority stakeholder, someone who had done the right thing when it was brought to her attention. I could be more actively visible as a cooperating witness. She said both had implications for what came next with my family. I said I needed to think about Marcus. She was quiet. I said I needed him to know before this became public. Not to warn Lawrence or Cassandra. Not to interfere with anything. But because Marcus was my brother, and whatever had been broken between us over the years, he didn't deserve to walk into this blindly. He deserved to hear it from me. Priya said she understood. She said if I was going to tell him, it needed to happen in the next 48 hours. I called Marcus the next morning and asked if I could come to Columbus. He was surprised. We didn't do that, show up in each other's cities without a specific occasion. I said I needed to talk to him about something important and that I needed to do it in person. He said okay. His voice was careful. I drove to his apartment that afternoon. It was a nice apartment. Marcus had always been good at creating the right surfaces, clean and furnished with care, the kind of space that said he was doing well without having to say it. He made coffee. We sat at his kitchen table, and I watched him watch me, trying to read what was coming. I told him everything. I started with the investment. I told him I had owned 12% of Alroy and Marsh for 3 years. I watched his face process that. Then I told him about the quarterly anomalies, about calling Terrence, about the forensic report, about the Delaware LLC, about Gregory Fenn, about $3.4 million and the Henderson Group. I told him about the hallway conversation at the engagement party. He would very still when I got to that part. I told him what Lawrence had said, that Marcus's family had significant financial holdings through Whitfield Financial Partners, that the marriage would give the firm something to point to, that Cassandra had done her research. Marcus looked at the table. I told him about the meeting with Agent Marsh, about the SEC investigation, about the 10 days. When I finished, the apartment was very quiet. Outside, Columbus was doing what Columbus does on November afternoons, moving steadily through its grace-keyed business. Marcus put his coffee down. He said he needed a minute. I said take as long as he needed. He sat there for a while. And then he said something that I had not heard from him before, not in 34 years of being a sister. He said he was sorry. Not the kind of sorry that people say when they're caught doing something. The other kind. The one that means I have been looking the wrong direction for a long time, and I am only now seeing the cost of it. He said he had known something was off with Cassandra. Not about the firm, not the specifics, but that there was a quality to her attention toward him, a precision to her interest, that sometimes felt like it had a purpose he couldn't quite see. He said he had told himself he was being paranoid. That nobody is ever just what they seem, and that was fine. That love didn't require perfect transparency. That everyone had angles and ambitions. He said he had wanted it to work. He had wanted it so badly that he had looked away from the things that didn't add up. I told him I understood that impulse. He looked at me. He said he had not been a good brother. I said we could talk about that part later. I said right now he needed to think about what he was going to do. He asked what his options were. I said that was between him and his own conscience. I said Priya could connect him with an attorney if he wanted one. I said the investigation was going to proceed regardless of anything he did now. I said his cooperation would likely be noted. I said his relationship with Cassandra was something only he could decide. He was quiet again. Then he said he was going to call her. He said he was going to ask her directly. He said he needed to hear it from her. I said okay. I drove home. Marcus called me 2 days later. He said the conversation with Cassandra had been what he expected, and also worse than he'd expected. He said she hadn't denied the firm's problems. She'd said that everyone in business operated in gray areas, and that she had genuinely cared about him, that the two things weren't mutually exclusive. She'd said it with the confidence of someone who had convinced themselves this was true. Marcus said he had ended the engagement. He said it very quietly. He said he'd returned the ring. He said Cassandra had been cold about it in a way that told him most of what he needed to know. I told him I was sorry it had come to this. He said he wasn't sure he was. He said it felt more like relief than grief, which was its own kind of grief in a way. I understood that too. The SEC's formal investigation became public 10 days later, exactly as Priya had predicted. The announcement was straightforward. Elroy and Marsh Consulting Group was under investigation for potential securities violations and investor fraud. Document preservation demands had been issued. The firm was cooperating. Lawrence Elroy had retained counsel. The Cleveland Business Press picked it up the same day. Regional news ran it the following morning. By the end of the week, it had reached the national financial press, not front page, not dramatic, but there in the business section where people who pay attention would find it. Lawrence Elroy did not call me. Vivian Elroy did not call me. Fletcher did not call me. I did not expect them to. Cassandra called once, from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was composed and precise and asked if there was anything that could be done to separate my ongoing investment in the firm from the current situation. She said she hoped we could be civil about this. I didn't return the call. The full investigation ran for 8 months. I gave 2 depositions and submitted Terrence's forensic report in its entirety. The Henderson Group and several other investors had come forward by then, and the picture that emerged was comprehensive. Lawrence Elroy and Gregory Fenn had been running the slow drain structure for approximately 2 years. Total investor capital involved was confirmed at $4.1 million. In the end, Lawrence Elroy agreed to a settlement with the SEC that included disgorgement of $4.1 million, an additional civil penalty, a permanent bar from serving as an officer or director of any registered investment firm, and a requirement to cooperate fully with the parallel civil suits from the defrauded investors. Gregory Fenn received similar terms. The firm itself was wound down in an orderly process that was overseen by a court-appointed monitor. No one went to prison, because civil securities fraud cases rarely end that way. But the consequences were real and lasting and proportionate to what had been done. The 23 employees were given severance packages funded from the recovered assets and transitioned to other firms with the help of an employment placement program that Agent Marsh's office arranged. I know because I followed it. I checked. The Henderson Group and the other investors recovered approximately 70 cents on the dollar. Not everything. Never everything in cases like this. But something. I want to tell you about the week after the settlement announcement because it contains something I didn't expect and didn't know how to categorize at the time. Fletcher Elroy, Cassandra's brother, called me. I almost didn't answer. We had spoken exactly twice, both times in the orbit of family gatherings, both times briefly. I had no particular feelings about Fletcher. He had always struck me as a man who existed mostly in relation to his father, the way some children of powerful people do, not without their own substance, but still fundamentally shaped by the gravitational pull of someone else's ambition. I answered because I was curious. Fletcher's voice on the phone was different from the Fletcher I'd met at the dinners. Less polished. Quieter. He said he'd gotten my number from Marcus. He said he hoped that was all right. I said it was fine. I asked what he could do for me. He said he wanted to tell me that he hadn't known. About the LLC, about the Henderson Group, about what his father had been doing. He said he worked in the firm's business development division and had always been kept at a certain distance from the financial structure, which he now understood was deliberate. He said he had clients of his own who had been affected. People he'd brought to the firm personally, people who trusted him, people who were now recovering 70 cents on the dollar because of something he hadn't seen coming and couldn't have stopped even if he'd known. He said he didn't know why he was calling. He said he just thought I should know that not everyone in that house had been in on it. I told him I appreciated him calling. He said he was considering leaving the consulting industry entirely. He said trust was the only real currency in the work, and he wasn't sure he had enough left to spend. I told him that was a fair way to think about it. I told him that what he did next was entirely his choice, but that what I had learned, both from building my own firm and from the past several months, was that the people who leave an industry because something terrible happened in it often take with them the most valuable thing, which is the understanding of exactly how the terrible thing worked. That a person who has seen fraud from the inside, who knows what the rerouted fees look like and what the reassuring language sounds like and where the gaps appear in documents that shouldn't have gaps, that person has a specific and genuine usefulness in the world if they choose to deploy it honestly. He was quiet for a moment. He said that was an interesting way to look at it. I said it was the only way that made any sense to me. He thanked me and hung up. I don't know what Fletcher did after that conversation. I didn't follow it. Some things you put down when you're done with them, not because they don't matter, but because they've resolved into something you no longer need to hold. The investigation itself produced 2 additional findings that Terrence uncovered in the final phase of his reporting, findings that weren't central to the SEC case, but that I found worth noting. The first was that Gregory Fenn had run an almost identical structure at a different firm in 2016, a firm that had been dissolved quietly with no formal investigation. Several investors from that earlier situation had lost money without any recovery mechanism. Priya connected that information to the appropriate parties, and while it was too old for meaningful new action, it did add to the picture of what had been happening and for how long. The second finding was that the firm's internal auditor, a man named James Perro who had been with Alroy and Marsh for 7 years, had flagged the LLC routing irregularities in an internal memo 18 months prior. His memo had been received by Lawrence Alroy's office and had not resulted in any internal action. James Perro had not said anything publicly because he was afraid of losing his job and because he was not certain enough of what he'd seen to go further. When Terrence found the memo, I asked Priya to make sure Agent Marsh's team was aware of it. Not because James Perro needed to be in trouble, he didn't. He'd done what he could within the limits of his situation. But because his memo was evidence of when Lawrence Alroy had known and had chosen to continue regardless, and that distinction mattered for the terms of the settlement. Priya said she'd already flagged it. Of course she had. James Perro, as far as I know, was one of the 23 who landed at a different firm with a good reference and a clear conscience. I hope so. People who try to do the right thing within imperfect systems deserve better outcomes than they usually get, and sometimes the only way to give them one is to make sure their record reflects the truth. The settlement hearing itself was a single morning in a federal courtroom in Cleveland. I attended, though I was not required to. Priya had suggested it might be worth being present, and I agreed with her reasoning, which was that closure sometimes requires a physical presence in the room where things are officially resolved. The courtroom was smaller than television suggests courtrooms are. Wood paneling, fluorescent light that made everyone look slightly unwell, rows of seats that were mostly occupied by attorneys and a handful of reporters, and the investors' legal representatives. The Henderson Group's lead attorney, a woman named Callista Obi, gave a brief statement on behalf of her clients. She was precise and factual and did not perform any emotion, which I respected enormously. Lawrence Alroy sat at the defendant's table in a suit that was still good, still impeccably fitted, and stared straight ahead during most of the proceedings. He was thinner than the last time I had seen him. His hair, still silver, had grown slightly longer at the back in a way that suggested the careful grooming had slipped. He did not look at me. Vivian was not present. When the settlement terms were read aloud, the room was very still. The judge asked Lawrence Alroy if he understood the terms of the agreement and accepted them voluntarily. Lawrence said yes. His voice was even. Whatever he was feeling, he had the discipline not to show it in that room, and I found that I didn't need him to. The document existed. The record existed. The $4.1 million existed in the recovery fund, which was being administered for distribution to the affected investors. That was enough. The judge concluded the proceedings in under 40 minutes. I walked out into the Cleveland morning, which was gray and cold and entirely ordinary. Priya stood beside me for a moment, both of us looking at the street. She said it was done. I said yes. She said she was proud of the work we'd done. Not with drama, just as a statement of fact. I told her the same. We went separate ways. I drove back to Columbus through the flat Midwestern landscape I had grown up in and had never entirely left, and I thought about what it means to build something. Not a company, though I had done that. Something harder. The patient, unglamorous work of becoming the person you need to be to handle the things that are eventually going to require handling. You don't know what those things are in advance. You don't know what the hallway conversation will be, or which quarterly report will have the note that's slightly too vague, or which moment will ask you to choose between your own comfort and doing something genuinely useful. You just build, document by document, year by year, detail by detail. And then, when it matters, you're ready. I'll tell you one more thing about that drive home, because it contains something I think is true and worth saying out loud. I had spent several months, during the active investigation, keeping the situation almost entirely to myself. Not because secrecy was required, though discretion certainly was, but because I have always processed the hardest things in private. It is one of my genuine flaws. The one my college roommate, the one who called me the human spreadsheet, identified accurately when she said that I treated my own emotional experience like proprietary information. She wasn't wrong. On that drive home from Cleveland, for the first time in months, I let myself feel the full weight of what had happened. Not the legal parts, the human parts. The fact that the people who were supposed to see me clearly had chosen, again and again, not to. That my own family had let me be erased from the story of my own generosity for 4 years. That Cassandra Elroy had sat across from me at a white tablecloth lunch and been warm and deliberate and gracious while treating me as a tool. That being called peripheral by a man who didn't know my name was in his company's ownership documents had still, despite everything I know about myself, stung. I felt all of that on that drive. I let it be true without trying to resolve it or reframe it or extract the useful lesson from it before I was ready. And then, somewhere around the Licking County line, I let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because I had somewhere to be. I had a call with a client at 2. I had a new analyst whose performance review I needed to complete. I had a brother I was getting to know, finally, at 34. I had a mother who was trying. I had work that was real and mine and built from the ground up by my own hands, without anyone's permission. I had, in the most literal sense possible enough. That is the thing about justice, real justice, the kind that comes through documents and filings and forensic reports and federal settlements rather than through the cleaner versions we write for ourselves in our heads. It doesn't feel like winning. It doesn't feel like the moment in a movie where the music swells and the right person looks the wrong person in the eye and says the thing that lands perfectly. It feels like completion. Like a calculation that has been running for a long time finally resolving to its correct answer. Quiet. Exact. Earned. I pulled off the highway at my exit and called Marcus to see if he wanted to get dinner. He said yes. He said he knew a new place that was supposed to be good. I said let's try it. About 3 months after the settlement, I was sitting in my office on a Wednesday morning when my phone rang. It was my mother. She called more often now, since the events of the previous year. The calls were still slightly uncertain, both of us still learning the geography of a relationship that had always been navigated badly, but they were real. She said she had run into someone from Zanesville who had read about the whole situation. She said the woman had shown her the article, the one in the Cleveland paper that described me as a financial fraud investigator who had exposed a years-long investor scheme in a firm where she held a minority stake. My mother said, I didn't know. I said I know, Mom. She said, I've said that a lot recently. I said I know. She asked if she could come visit. She said she wanted to see my office and maybe have dinner, just us, no occasion, just to be somewhere together. Her voice was careful and real in the way it had been getting lately. Not performing, just herself. I told her to come on Friday. I told her we'd go somewhere nice. 1 year later, Whitfield Financial Partners had grown by another 11%. We opened a satellite office in Cleveland, which felt like the appropriate kind of irony, quiet and useful rather than pointed. I hired 2 new analysts, one of whom was fresh out of a state school in Dayton and reminded me of myself in ways that I tried not to project onto her too obviously. I gave her every opportunity one would have wanted. Marcus and I talk twice a week now on average. We're finding the shape of something we never really had. It's uneven and sometimes awkward, the way anything is when it's new even if the people in it are not. But it's honest in a way nothing between us has ever been before, and I'll take honest and uneven over comfortable and false every single time. He is doing well. He started seeing someone late in the spring. She teaches environmental law at a university in Columbus and makes him laugh in a way that seems entirely unmanaged. And the first time I had dinner with both of them and watched him relax completely in the middle of a conversation, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't known was still unsettled. My mother came to visit in November. We had dinner at a restaurant I liked near my office, a small Italian place with good wine and enough ambient noise that a conversation could be private without trying. She sat across from me and looked at me with the direct, clear-eyed look of someone who has been doing some accounting of her own. She said she had spent a lot of time thinking about why she had treated me differently than Marcus for so long. She said she didn't have a clean answer that would satisfy either of them, but she said she thought part of it was that I had always seemed like I didn't need her the way Marcus did, and that she had let that become an excuse. I told her I had needed her. I told her I had just stopped asking. She held my hand across the table and said she was going to try to do better. Not as a promise that fixed anything, just as a fact she was choosing to make true. I believed her. Not all the way. Not yet. But enough. Enough to order dessert. Enough to stay an extra hour. Enough to make plans for the following month. I drove home that night through the November streets of Columbus, the city lit and ordinary and alive, and I thought about the word peripheral. I thought about what it meant to be seen as the background of someone else's story, to be the detail that makes the main characters look more substantial by contrast, to be the quiet one, the serious one, the one who never quite fit the frame. And I thought about what Lawrence Elroy had discovered, too late, which is that the background isn't static. That the quiet ones are quiet for a reason, and the reason isn't absence. It's accumulation. Every overlooked year. Every conversation where someone spoke past me to get to someone more interesting. Every family dinner where my work wasn't asked about. Every achievement that landed in an empty room. Every time I drove home through the dark without the radio on and added one more thing to the understanding I was building of who I was and what I was capable of. Peripheral. I put the key in my door and thought, no. Central, actually. To the investigation. To the recovery of $4.1 million. To 23 people who got to go home to their families with something in their pockets. To a federal settlement that bore my name as cooperating witness in the footnotes of a case that mattered. To my brother, who finally saw me. To my mother, who is learning to. To myself, which is the one that took the longest and cost the most, and which I am still working on, carefully, document by document, the way I have always worked. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just with intention and patience and the deep, abiding stubbornness of a woman who grew up in a cold house and decided the cold was useful because it taught her to build her own warmth. I'll ask you something. Has someone ever made you feel like a footnote in your own story? Like your work, your choices, your quiet sacrifices were invisible to the people who should have seen them most clearly? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you think or feel something real, subscribe. There are more stories like this one, and every one of them is about the same thing in the end. What happens when the person no one saw coming finally decides it's time to be seen? Thank you for being here.